Howdy students. In this video, I'll address an issue that generally does not come up in college courses. Why you should believe your professor. Your professor is most likely an expert in the material being presented, so in most classes you probably just assume the information being presented to you is correct. But climate change is not like every other subject. If you do a quick internet search, you will be able to find something that disputes just about every claim made by me and in the textbook. Your friends and family may believe climate change is a hoax and tell you that everything you're learning in this class is wrong. This situation brings up an important and interesting question. How do you determine whether or not to believe a scientific claim? To answer this question, it makes sense to understand how science actually generates knowledge. Science begins with a process that everyone learned in high school, which is probably described as the scientific method. In that, an individual scientist generates a hypothesis, runs experiments to test the hypothesis, and then reaches a conclusion about the hypothesis. But this is actually only the first step of the process that we call science. Before the conclusions of this individual scientist can be considered true, it must first be judged by the rest of the scientific community. This process starts with the original experimenter writing up a description of exactly what was done and how, the data, the calculations, and other methods of analysis in enough detail that someone knowledgeable in the field could reproduce the work. The resulting manuscript is then submitted for publication in a journal. The first formal control that the scientific community exercises on the quality of scientific work comes at this point. Scientific journals will not publish the paper until it has been critically examined by other scientists who are also experts in the subject. In this process, called peer review, the reviewer's job is to look for errors and weaknesses in the analysis that might cast doubt on the scientific results being described. If the reviewers do not find any problems in the paper, then it gets published in the peer-reviewed literature. Peer review is a highly effective filter which stops many errors from being published, but it cannot catch every problem. Reviewers occasionally fail to notice an obvious mistake, and there are some types of errors that reviewers cannot catch. They cannot tell if the author misread observations of an instrument or wrote a number down wrong, or if chemical samples used in an experiment were contaminated, or many other kinds of errors. But peer review is only the first level of testing and quality control applied to scientific claims. When an important or novel claim is published in the peer-reviewed literature, it then gets tested in what I call the crucible of science. This refers to additional testing by the scientific community. This might mean replicating the original experiment as was described in the original peer-reviewed paper. This is important because while one scientist might make a mistake in the experiment, do something sloppy or misinterpret the results, and peer reviewers might fail to catch it, it is unlikely that several independent groups will all make the same mistake. Consequently, as other scientists reproduce the original experiment, the scientific community increasingly comes to accept that claim as correct. In addition, scientists can test the implications of a scientific claim. For example, if someone claims the Earth is warming, we would expect that ice all over the world should be melting. That's a testable hypothesis, and if it turns out to be true, then that also increases our confidence in the original hypothesis. Naturally, all of these tests of the original claim will themselves be published in the peer-reviewed literature. So the peer-reviewed literature contains both the original claim as well as all of the attempts to test it. Over time, claims become so well verified by accumulating independent evidence, resolving controversy, and rejecting contrary claims that they come to be regarded simply as facts. For example, we now accept as facts that the structure of DNA is a double helix, that atoms obey the laws of quantum mechanics, and that burning fossil fuels has increased the abundance of CO2 in the atmosphere. There's so much evidence that these claims are correct that further testing of them is considered unnecessary and uninteresting. This is what we mean we talk about scientific consensus. It is important to understand that we're not talking about a consensus among scientists, but rather a consensus in the peer-reviewed literature. While these should be basically the same, this is nevertheless a very important operational distinction. If I ask whether there is a consensus among scientists on some issue, how do you determine if consensus exists and whose opinion counts? If, on the other hand, you focus on consensus among papers published in the peer-reviewed literature, then it's easy to determine what the consensus is. You just read the literature. So we can now provide at least one answer to the question, how can you tell whether a scientific claim is actually supported by science? The most reliable way is to look in the peer-reviewed literature for multiple independent verifications. If many groups have tested a claim and its implications and found them to be true, then that claim is said to be likely true. Exactly how likely a claim is to be correct is determined by several factors, such as the number of independent analyses that have tested the claim, the stringency of those tests, and whether there are legitimate competing hypotheses. Now, it's worth also thinking about ways not to determine if a scientific claim is correct. So you do not want to watch cable TV and listen to people argue and determine who's right in a venue like that. Skilled orators can win arguments even when there's absolutely no evidence supporting their position. That's why in science, we don't resolve things with public debates. We resolve things by people writing arguments down in paper and publishing them in the literature. You don't do public debates. Similarly, you don't want to go out and find someone who will tell you something that you want to believe. If you want to believe that cigarette smoking is good for you, you can find someone who will tell you that. And sometimes they'll even have credentials, but that doesn't mean what they're telling you is actually correct. If you want to know what's true, look in the peer-reviewed literature. In the next video, we'll continue discussions of how science works and how it interfaces with policy. And now, your moment of dog.